We have some time now for questions. Please wait for the microphone, tell us who you are, and please make it a question rather than a long statement to give other people the opportunity to ask questions.
Ambassador Richard Bronowski, University of Sydney. What do you make of this story we've been hearing here about fresh demands in Israel to make people swear allegiance to the Jewish state of Israel? Is this a trade-off by some right-wing elements who would agree to handing back some of the properties on the West Bank, or desist from further construction? Could you give us some background, please?
Sure. For actually many years, although we've only heard about the issue recently, but for many years there's been an internal debate in Israel as to whether or not formal diplomatic recognition by Arab states will be sufficient to give Israel the kind of psychological security that it requires and demands as living in a potentially hostile neighborhood. One could hear this debate underway as far ago as 10 or 12 years, and you started to hear the discussion focus around whether or not Israel should be demanding of Arabs the recognition not just of the state of Israel, but of the right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel in some diplomatic formula. This was concretized by Prime Minister Netanyahu about a year and a half ago in the most important speech he's given on the peace process since taking office. He spoke at Bar Ilan University in Israel, and he said that for the first time a Likud prime minister said that he was ready to see an outcome of this conflict in a Palestinian state, living side by side with the state of Israel in peace and security, but it had two requirements. One was that Israel's security needs would be met in the context of this agreement, and the second is he now formalized this demand for Arab recognition of Israel's character, of its identity as a Jewish state. In the discussions thus far that have taken place, the Palestinian response to this has basically been twofold. Number one, in diplomacy, one is asked to recognize states. One is not asked to recognize a particular characteristic of a state. In fact, President Abbas in New York, as part of the UN General Assembly a few weeks ago, told an audience that if Israel changes its name to the Jewish state of Israel, they would get recognition from Palestinians as part of a peace settlement. If Palestine would recognize the new name, the Jewish state of Israel, but that he couldn't figure out why he would be asked to recognize a particular characteristic of Israel when Israel hasn't, in fact, made that decision itself. Almost in response to that, the Israeli Knesset has now adopted legislation which starts to move in the direction that Abbas was suggesting, but for the wrong reasons. And they have now legislated the adoption of what they're calling a loyalty oath that would be required of new immigrants to swear allegiance to the Jewish and democratic state of Israel, or some formulation like that. This is problematic for at least two constituencies. It's problematic for the non-Jewish citizens of the state of Israel, largely Arab citizens, who wonder what this means for them. They're not going to be required to take this oath since they're already citizens, but they wonder what it foreshadows in terms of requirements that may be imposed upon them in the future. And it raises questions also on the issue of the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Because if Israel is now getting into this issue of self-identification as a critical issue in the negotiations, then one could expect Palestinians to elevate the question of right of return to a kind of equal level and maybe think about a trade-off in which Palestinian right of return is recognized or recognition is sought for the payoff of Israel's self-identification as a Jewish state. It's a long way of saying I think it's a quite problematic initiative on the part of the state of Israel. I think it's genuinely aimed at dealing with a psychological issue of some importance, but I'm not sure that this is the solution that's going to present an outcome that's going to be acceptable to both sides.
Whit Mason.
Hi, Whit Mason. I'm a fellow of the West Asia program here at Lowy. Ambassador, I wonder what you think about Turkey's new activist role in the region generally, whether it's a good thing, and a little more specifically, whether you think Turkey might have a particular role to play in the peace process.
Well, the second part of the question is easier to answer than the first, because Turkey, in fact, began to play a rather positive role in the peace process a couple of years ago when it hosted or brokered proximity talks between Israel and Syria, using its then good relationship with Israel and its good relationship with Syria. The Syrians hosted a number of engagements that actually began to be productive and only came to an end because of the outbreak of war in Gaza at the end of 2008. And so one could envisage that Turkish role being recaptured at some point, given the relationship that Turkey has had with Syria and might be able to rebuild with Israel. And that leads to the first part of the question, and that Turkish policy seems to be in a period of some flux and evolution. Number one, the Turks seem to have concluded, probably correctly so, that they are not going to be offered membership in the European Union anytime in the near future, and that the quest for such membership would be futile to continue. And what that's given rise to is a set of policy ideas of having no enemies within its immediate neighborhood and building relationships as a pivotal state in Southern Europe, Western or Southwestern Asia, and the Middle East. The results of which have been quite impressive over the past couple of years in terms of trade statistics and political relationships that Turkey has been able to build. The one question mark, and I call it a question mark because I'm not sure we're at the end of the game yet, has been the degree to which Turkey has distanced itself from Israel. Now, there are some proximate reasons for this. The flotilla events in which Turkish citizens were killed when Israel took over the boat trying to reach Gaza has created a firestorm of protest in Turkey. Turkey, I think, feels that some of its interests have not been properly respected by Israel. Israel believes that Turkey has been overzealous in pursuit of its Arab policy. So there are a number of issues on the agenda, but those issues now have been elevated to quite a serious level. And, for example, the Turks are now demanding a formal apology from Israel for the flotilla, which is highly unlikely to be forthcoming. And that raises the question of whether or not that demand has been raised as a barrier to the improvement or restoration of relations, or whether or not someone will figure out a way to either dig a tunnel under it or a bridge over it and get back to a point where the Israeli-Turkish relationship can be rebuilt. So, in short, Turkey can have a very positive role to play once again in the peace process, but there's got to be a way to balance off in some way the growth of Turkish positive relations with Arabs, which should continue, with the offsetting deterioration of relations with Israel, which, if it continues, will not allow Turkey to exercise a role in the peace process.
Down the front here.
Ambassador, thank you. John Darwin. I've always been fascinated by the degree to which the US has used its economic muscle to both support and cajole various players, particularly Israel, in the peace process. And I just wonder whether this light at the end of the tunnel, otherwise known as the $12.5 to $15 trillion deficit, is going to aid a negotiating capacity, given the US's now capacity to cry poor to Israel in particular. And I just wondered to what degree that's has occurred in the past.
Yeah, welcome to our midterm elections, because these large issues in the economy are going to largely determine where our legislature is over the next couple of years. In some respects, the Middle East so far, and I will underline the word so far, seems to have been immune in American thinking to the impact of the financial crisis. Some years ago, when the United States was putting large numbers on the table, thinking about a $20 or $30 billion investment in the Middle East seemed unimportant. Just recently, we've had a revival of some of those numbers, and it has not raised a major outcry in Washington, surprisingly so. Now, I would suggest that if those numbers ever became more real, especially in the context of a divided Congress and administration, if you have a Democratic president and one or both houses of Congress controlled by Republicans, then the real battle gets joined over whether or not we still have the economic capacity to follow through on what we would like to do, on what we say we're ready to do verbally. That has not yet been tested, but it'll be fun to watch. Now I'm on the outside, of course, should that issue ever get joined.
I'll take an opportunity to ask a question myself. You provided something of a critique of the administration's policy on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. What's your assessment of its policy on Iran?
Yeah. If one were to juxtapose my view of the peace process in Iran, I'm inconsistent, because I think the administration has done a far better job, a far more subtle diplomacy, a far more agile diplomacy with respect to Iran than we have in the peace process. And I say this for the following reasons. If one looks at the general approach of the Bush administration for the previous 8 years, one saw that the United States resorted to 3 of the 4 tools in our diplomatic toolbox with respect to Iran. We certainly use rhetoric, a lot of nasty language back and forth. We certainly tried to use sanctions, economic pressures, and we kept on the table quite frontally the prospective use of force to reverse Iran's policy of trying to acquire nuclear weapons capability. The Bush administration, for its own reasons, chose not to engage in diplomacy of almost any sort. In fact, there are a number of studies done that suggests that there may have been several openings for diplomacy during the Bush administration period, but there was a total lack of interest on the part of that administration in responding to that diplomacy. President Bush, in fact, towards the end of his tenure, largely in attacking the then candidate Obama, although not by name, equated diplomacy with Iran as a kind of appeasement. And it tells you how President Bush looked at diplomacy as a tool of American power. President Obama, first as candidate Obama and now as president, has said that he doesn't rule out, in fact wants to integrate those first 3 elements of diplomacy, but has a very strong level of support for using diplomacy as far as it can go, either to achieve what it can achieve. And the reality is, I'm biased, having been a diplomat for 30 years, but diplomacy actually sometimes is successful. And it's sometimes successful in ways that we all even don't know about, because it's like the dog that didn't bark. It's the crisis that didn't happen. It's the problem that didn't occur. It's the war that didn't break out because of successful, quiet diplomacy. So on the one hand, you can use diplomacy, Obama has said, to try to actually accomplish something. But even if you fail to accomplish something, the very act of trying will help achieve your other purposes. For example, when President Bush tried to bring about international support for sanctions, he heard very often from Russia and China that they would not support sanctions because we hadn't tried diplomacy. Therefore, if you've tried diplomacy and are given the credit for having tried and it doesn't succeed, you can then go back to these countries, as we did, and say, look, we tried it, now we have to try some leverage, in this case, the use of sanctions. And in fact, that's what the administration has tried to do. Last October, in a meeting with the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and Germany, together with Iran, some very far-reaching ideas were put on the table, and it caught the Iranians by surprise. We know that there was an upheaval or turmoil within the Iranian leadership about what to do with this diplomatic initiative. Ultimately, Iran turned it down, which meant diplomacy was not successful. But it then allowed the United States and the other members of the Security Council to mobilize support for tougher sanctions, which passed the Security Council and in fact, in their own way, are starting to have some effect on the Iranian economy. Don't take me as your source, take former President Rafsanjani, who publicly has been critical of the lack of response of the Iranian leadership to the fact that sanctions are starting to bite and are starting to hurt. And what's most interesting is that the Obama administration, having tried diplomacy which didn't succeed, having parlayed that lack of success into sanctions, now says it's ready to go back to diplomacy, which in some ways is the smartest move of all because it keeps the Iranians off balance. And there's nothing better in this case than to keep them a little off balance as they try to figure out their next steps. The Iranians have suggested publicly that they may be ready to go back to diplomacy. We know their program, at least from what we see in public sources, is having some trouble anyway. So there may actually be a moment being carved out now in time and space in which diplomacy may have an impact on Iran's willingness to suspend, if not actually end, its enrichment. And if you can achieve even a suspension, then the level of tension, the level of preparations for the possible use of force goes down considerably and gives you more time to play out the possibility of a diplomatic option. So I'm actually quite impressed with the administration's agility in the case of Iran. I don't know whether it's a strategic success or whether it's just the luck of having good tactics, but whatever, I would give them a very strong pat on the back for what is so far a rather deft display of diplomatic prowess.
Michael Wesley.
Ambassador, two questions. The first one is, what effect on America's image has the invasion and then withdrawal from Iraq had on America's image in the Middle East and the peace process? Second question, what effect has the deep division in Palestinian Authority between Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in the West Bank, how will that play out and affect progress of peace negotiations?
Yeah, both excellent questions. And thank you personally, Michael, for the invitation here today. He's the boss of this place, so I figured I better be nice to him. Look, on the first issue, even a casual traveler to the Middle East has noticed in the last 7 years a marked deterioration in the U.S. position in that region. I think the leaders in the region were prepared to give the United States some time to explore what a military action against Iraq could accomplish. When the nature of that exploration changed from the search for weapons of mass destruction and the degradation of Iraqi military capabilities to the effort to build a democracy from the end of a gun, I think we lost not just the Arab Street, as it's called, but also Arab leadership. And it doesn't take much time in the region to understand how seriously the U.S. position was affected, not just in terms of our popularity, but in terms of the ability of leaders to respond positively to U.S. requirements and demands. We didn't lose it entirely. In a place that I know well, Egypt, we continue to enjoy a great deal of quiet cooperation in military and other areas, but it's a level of cooperation that now has to be handled extraordinarily gingerly because of the degree to which what we're doing as a result of that military cooperation is so unpopular in the region. I think it's for those reasons that Obama entered office with the idea of immediately repairing, or as the title of this talk is called, resetting the button with respect to the Middle East. His efforts to reach out to the Muslim world in his speeches at Istanbul and Cairo were part of that. The words, the rhetoric that he's been using in describing America's relationships both internally with our own Muslim community as well as our external relationship with the Islamic world has also tried to do that. But we're in a period now of some anticipatory nervousness. Arab leaders are saying, show us the, what was that movie? Show us the money, show us the results. What are you actually going to do with this new reset American policy? Arab Street is, I think, less patient, and there's a great deal of cynicism that maybe all they heard from the United States was positive talk. So there's a bit of, I think, concern inside the Beltway in Washington that the time for us to, in a sense, demonstrate that our approach to the region is changing is fast coming due, and results, or at least a greater effort to achieve results, has to be registered. On the second question about the Palestinian community and its internal challenges and difficulties, as I mentioned earlier with respect to the challenge of leadership, President Abbas, who is negotiating on behalf of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, actually presides over a fractured political community and a divided divided community geographically. And it's therefore a valid question that many have raised, whether or not any state, in this situation Israel, would be wise to make concessions to a leader who doesn't even control his own political community. And it's a very valid question, and one that's been raised consistently at least since 2007, when Hamas took over Gaza, and that was followed a few months later by the Annapolis Peace Conference. The argument made in response is that a distinction needs to be drawn between the effort to reach an agreement and the validation of that agreement that would lead to its implementation. In other words, Abbas still reflects the formal policy-making apparatus of the Palestinian community. In Oslo in 1993, the PLO took the mandate for negotiating peace with Israel, and Abbas is the head of the PLO. And therefore, Israel can negotiate with Abbas, but can also expect that once the negotiations conclude in an agreement, that agreement will not be implemented until there is some ratification mechanism within the larger Palestinian community, a referendum, an election, some mechanism that will demonstrate that Abbas is not a minority leader. I think without that, Israel would be justified in hanging tough. With it, there could be some confidence that Palestinian politics will sort itself out over time in a period of implementation based on benchmarks. And so it's a solvable problem, but a great challenge in the meantime.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I like to say to people that the Middle East is not an interest, it's an affliction. And for those of you who, like me, find yourself so afflicted, today was a real treat or treatment. So please join me again in thanking Ambassador Dan Kurtzer.